Let me tell you a few things about the speaker. Carol already mentioned his name and topic, but for your college students, you'll be interested to know he had almost completed his a degree in study of architecture when he changed his mind and decided that wasn't what he wanted to do and started over. He grew up in North Carolina. Before he came to Santa Rosa in 1989 to lead Congregation Shomrei Torah, he spent 29 years with a congregation in Northwestchester County in New York State. To become a rabbi, after earning a Bachelor of Arts at the University of Cincinnati, he attended the Hebrew Union College, where he earned degrees in Master of Arts in Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts in Hebrew Letters. And later, much later, he earned a doctoral degree at the New York Theological Seminary. Rabbi Robinson is a person who has religious beliefs, and he has been involved in peace and justice for almost his entire life. Now, I'm just going to list a few things just to give you the flavor, because we want to get on with the lecture today. But a sample of his activities. He was active with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference when they were struggling for civil rights for the African Americans in the South. And he worked with Elma, and when he was in St. Augustine, while he was arrested and jailed. His concern about peace has led him to be with delegations that during the Contra War in Nicaragua, he went there. And more recently, he spent time in Israel on the West Bank and Gaza. He served for many years as a member of the National Council of the Fellowship for Reconciliation. That's just a few. Now, locally, for 2 years, he was president of the Sonoma County Force on the Homeless. And for over 2 years, he worked as a volunteer at the Family Support Center, where he was leading groups in self-esteem. I first met Rabbi Robinson over 30 years ago in Southern California, and I'm pleased to say he's one of my most valued and best friends. Will you please welcome Rabbi Robinson?
Hi. It's a pleasure to be welcomed by my hiking buddy. Last summer, Robert and I were in Great Basin National Park, where he climbed his first 13,000-foot peak. When I get up and walk over here to speak, it feels like a 14,000-foot peak. I am pleased and honored to be here this afternoon as one of the resource persons of the distinguished Sonoma State University Holocaust Lecture Series. I have attended several lectures every year for the past few years, and have been impressed by the leadership provided by the university, Dr. Steiner, and by the community, the Holocaust Studies Committee, by the exceptional quality of the lectures, and by the students and community people who attend these lectures, never on pleasant subjects, seeking to know and understand a quest which I can only interpret as being motivated by a desire which you haven't even acknowledged to yourselves, but nevertheless a desire to build a better, more just and loving world. Why else would you be here? Now, a friend of mine in the East is serving as part-time rabbi of a little congregation on the eastern shore of Maryland. In a storeroom in this old synagogue, he found a number of cartons of a charming and informative book published 40 years ago. You'll know it's old. The price on the paperback says $1.25. It's the price of a Sunday paper today. But it was published by Ludwig Lewison. Ludwig Lewison was a famous professor and literary figure, novelist, writer, who was born in Berlin in 1882 and came to the United States in 1992 with his family to South Carolina. when he was 10 years old. And in South Carolina, his parents, who were Jewish by birth, and that's about it, gave him nothing. And when he was an older teenager, after looking around, he joined the Methodist Church, looking for a religious home. As an adult, he began to recapture his Jewish heritage, which his parents had not passed on to him. Now, this is the book, This Jewish Heritage by Ludwig Lewison. Now, it so happens I have 3 copies here with me today, which I would like to give away to 3 students at Sonoma State University. Now, I'll tell you, all you have to do to get one is to come forward and answer the question, who are the Jews? Now, I hope at least 2 of these people won't be Jews, but I must tell you, I have a guarantee it will have nothing to do with your term grade, and there will be no wrong answers. What you believe to be is part of the answer. Is there anyone here who'd like one of these books? Who are the Jews? Come on. You can't be wrong. Be gutsy. Say something.
I'm not quite sure who they are. That's why I'm here.
Not quite sure, and that's why you're here. Yes. The chosen people. Do you know any idea what that means? Chosen by God. Or somebody say, by God, they're chosen. But yes. Well, who follow the Old Testament. Okay, there. Would you come get your books? What? You're not a student. That gives a student a chance. Another student. Student want one of these books? They're really charming and lovely, and you'll learn much more by reading these books, which are written beautifully, than you'll ever learn from me here today. What? Who? The Jewish people are survivors. Oh, what a beautiful answer. Great answer. I'll tell you, I want to comment on that answer first. Max de Montt, who was a Finnish Jew, who wrote a book, Jews, God, and History. It's available in paperback in any paperback bookstore and has sold more copies than any other one-volume history of the Jewish people. He doesn't say this in this book, but in my previous congregation, we had him as a lecturer. And Max de Montt says, wrong to see the Jews as the sufferers of history. Instead, they have gone down to the depth and risen to the top of the wave. They are the surfers and survivors of Jewish history. This is Max de Montt. He thinks of the empires, the great empires of the ancient world that conquered the Jewish people. Rome, Babylonia, Assyria, Egypt, they're all gone. And somehow or other, the survivors are still here. All the categories we use to pigeonhole and classify people, religion, race, ethnic group, nation, are true for some Jews, but not all Jews, which makes the answer to the question we are to deal with here today more complex and more intriguing. Jews are a religious community. At first glance, true for many Jews. However, does a religious community normally include a language developed within that community and a homeland which that community was rooted in and to which members of that community have always had a spiritual attachment? Thousands of Jews are indifferent, say even hostile to religion, yet remain passionate Jews. And they would object to being defined as members of a religious community, a category with which many Jews would be perfectly satisfied. The Jews are a race or ethnic community. True for many Jews who are members of a particular racial community which shares physical characteristics such as skin, hair, eye shape, language, and culture. I look stereotypically Jewish, right? Just like you'd expect a Jew to look. When I was in the Philippines 50 years ago, Every place I went, I was asked over and over again, "Are you Spanish?" Now I'll tell you, my mother's mother descended from a Spanish Jewish family which had come to this continent before the Revolutionary War. My grandmother was both a member of the DAR and the UDC. For those of you who don't speak the proper alphabet soup, that means the Daughters of American Revolution and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So is that the source of my Jewish appearance? I don't know. But I do know that when I was in seminary at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, we had a number of interfaith fellows working for their PhDs in Bible, rabbinics, or Near Eastern studies, many of whom later taught at universities and Protestant and Catholic seminaries. Many times I was aware sitting in a seminar and my mind would wander. I'm sure that never happens to anybody here. And I'd start looking around at my fellow students, and the thought would strike me that if someone were to come into the room and was told to pick out the 5 or 7, or if it were a large lecture, 10 non-Jews in the room, they would invariably have picked out the wrong persons, with the possible exception of Murray Banks, now Dr. Murray Banks, of an African American student. But don't be too sure about the African Americans. There happen to be black Jewish congregations in many cities in the East, and many of you are probably aware of the Falashas, or the black Jews of Ethiopia, those who escaped the enormous pressure for conversion to Christianity in the 19th century, and who were primarily subsistent farmers in the mountainous province of Gundar. Many have immigrated to Israel. The North African Jews who either have immigrated to Israel or you see them in North Africa, in Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya, are ethnically Arabs, language, dress, and skin color, but religiously and historically Jews. A racial or ethnic group? Indeed, but a different ethnic group from most of the European Jews who immigrated to the Americas. A nation implies geographic boundaries and citizenship, as well as language and culture. Jews are citizens of the myriad countries where they live, wherever citizenship is permitted. We vote and serve in the armies. We do everything that citizens do. Jews living in the state of Israel are part of that nation. Israeli is their nationality. They speak their national language, vote and serve in the armed forces. However, just to complicate matters, there are many Israelis who are Arab Christians, Muslims, and Druze, and so citizens of the state of Israel. Their nationality is Israeli. The category nation to describe the Jews doesn't quite fit everyone either, in my opinion. It is my contention that the Jews are a unique group, torn out of the context of history, a group that doesn't easily and comfortably fit into existent categories. A description, more than one word, although some of you have done some pretty good, the survivors was a pretty good one word, but it takes a description, more than one word, definition to tell who we are. There are, thank God, other survivors. There are others who follow what you call the Old Testament. The state of Israel has a law of return. It's unique to that country and to no other earth. Israel was founded as a haven for Jews when doors were closed to us. When Jews were fleeing Nazi Germany, the borders of many countries were barred to them. No Jew could enter the United States unless someone, a property owner, would sign an affidavit for them guaranteeing that they would never need public assistance. This happened to refugees from communist states, later Cubans or Vietnamese. One of the tragedies for European Jewry was that Hitler wasn't a communist. The United States' virulent anti-communism might have then opened doors for Jews. You probably remember the story of the Hamburg American liner that left Hamburg loaded with Jews, came to the United States, stayed off the port of Newport News, Norfolk. For 2 weeks, the German captain didn't want to take, and historians tell us there was a fight between Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin. Eleanor Roosevelt wanted to permit them to land, although no one was there to sign affidavits for them. And Franklin, who was a good politician, understood that this wasn't good because too many people in the United States would not be happy with a shipload of Jews landing on our shores. So they were taken back eventually to Hamburg, where nearly all of them died in the death camps. After World War II, the same situation still existed for European Jews. 2 years after the war was over, tens of thousands of Jews were still sitting in displaced person camps in Europe, some the same places that had been concentration camps, waiting for a country that would take them. It was very important, therefore, when the State of Israel was founded, that it be a place where any Jew would be immediately accepted and could become a citizen by declaration. You arrived in Israel, you said, I am a Jew, I want citizenship, and you still can. You sign papers and you're immediately a citizen. A Jew does not have to go through a naturalization process. This question of who is a Jew, that's the reduction of who are the Jews. The question of who is a Jew became a legal question more than 40 years ago. A Roman Catholic monk by the name of Brother Daniel moved to Israel and applied for citizenship by declaration as a Jew, which he had been before he converted to Christianity on becoming a Catholic. Brother Daniel maintained that since he was a Catholic, that before he was a Catholic cleric, he was a Jew who had gone into hiding in Poland, in Nazi-occupied Poland, and he was still a Jew, he claimed, who was also a Catholic monk. The Israeli government knew it had a problem. Before the Supreme Court made its ruling, letters went out to leading Jews in different areas of Jewish life all over the world, and to people in Israel, asking for a definition of who is a Jew. I was in seminary at the time. Dr. Samuel Cohen, who was the prophetology at the Hebrew Union College, was one of those addressed. His answer was that anyone who was born of a Jewish mother and had not severed his or her connection with the Jewish people through conversion, or anyone not born of Jewish parents who had joined with the Jewish people through conversion, was indeed a Jew. This, as I remember, was pretty much the answer accepted by the State of Israel and avails today. If you're wondering, Brother Daniel was not allowed, was ruled that he was not entitled to citizenship by declaration, that he would have to become a citizen if he wished by a naturalization process, but he was allowed to live in the State of Israel. The Jewish people, this special category, are very much like an extended family. We feel a kinship for other Jews. The Jewish people have always been an open-ended people. There are those who leave and separate themselves from the Jewish people, as Brother Daniel did. And those who join themselves with us, and this has been very true from the beginning of our history. I might make just a comment on Brother Daniel. I have been too many places. I can remember going into different churches where I was invited to speak and someone telling me, "Oh, we have a Jew who belongs to our church." In my head, it is a former Jew, someone who is deracinated, who has cut themselves off from their roots, who has cut the tie. Many Jews have blended in with the surrounding peoples and assimilated into the mass and become lost Jews, while others have stubbornly maintained a separate identity when it would have been much easier and much safer not to do so. The story of the people in its beginning years is told in the Bible or Holy Scriptures or in Hebrew Tanakh, which Christians refer to as the Old Testament, but which a term knowledgeable Jews do not use. It's not the old one that has been superseded as for us by a New Testament, which means covenant, a new covenant. When the Christians use the term Old Testament, they refer to a covenant between God and the people Israel, which they say has been severed by the new covenant between God and the Christian church, or the Christian household. Judaism takes its nature and shape. Oh, just a minute. With its vision of an imageless deity, imageless universal deity. When the nation is defeated by the Babylonians, I skipped a page. I knew that, something was wrong. The Bible, which I just referred to, the Tanakh, is both history and prehistory. It is also law and literature. It is mainly concerned with the relationship of the people to God. Impossible to prove from outside sources, and anyone who is a contemporary historian or scientist has to have outside sources to verify what they find in the Bible. Just having one source is not enough. And it's impossible to prove from outside sources the existence of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, those great heroic figures, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Jacob and Leah and Rachel, and their 12 children. Where they actually lived or not, or their prototypes for tribes, is impossible to determine. Their migrations fit actual historical patterns, and they do reflect the self-understanding of the people. When these stories about the patriarchs were written down, which according to scholars is between the 10th and 6th centuries before the Common Era. Jews do not say AD and BC, using dates based on Christ. We use the term BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, Common Era. According to Jewish tradition, Abraham is the first Jew. The tradition is of separate identity. When he leaves Haran with his family, his entourage, according to the Bibles, which includes souls he had acquired in Haran, which the Jewish tradition understands to be non-related people who join with Abraham in his concept of the unseen God. Anthropologists would say that the self-understanding of the people begins with markers. They are not just like everyone around them. They are like everyone else, but at the same time they are different from all other peoples. The historic memory of the people is of migrations again and again. One of these is into Egypt, where they eventually become a slave class and participate in the first slave revolt in history, centuries before Spartacus and the revolt against Rome. Returning to Canaan after 400 years, their journey takes them to Sinai, and a transforming event that changes a ragged band of ex-slaves into a people who takes its meaning from its relationship with God, and from then on believes that its very existence in history can fulfill some cosmic purpose. That's what someone meant when they said the Jews are the chosen people. That was you. The memory of Sinai is mythic and mystical and welds a rude group into a people with a purpose and a destiny, who knows itself from then on as a chosen or choosing people, a people with a calling. It is significant that in the Bible there are 30 times references back to the Egyptian experience, the experience of slavery and oppression, always with the admonition, "They shall know the heart of the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt," or "you shall love the stranger as yourself." Once in the Hebrew Scriptures comes the command to love God. "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might." 30 times to love the stranger. The paradoxical separateness of the Jewish people and the universal mission to love others, critical to the self-definition of the Jews from biblical times until now. The Jews are a people who preserves its own identity in order to fill a mission for all humanity, to participate in the struggle for justice and peace for all. Incidentally, contemporary scholarship tells us that not all of our ancestors not all the ancestors of this people were ever in Egypt. Those who left Egypt joined themselves with related tribes in the hills of Judah, and the 12 tribes become one people around 1000 of the Common Era. Judaism takes its nature and shape with its vision of an imageless deity, a deity who cannot be represented by anything on the earth below or the heavens above. That happens when the nation is defeated by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, and the leaders, artisans, and priestly class are carried into exile to Babylon, which would be where the present Iraq is, where they founded a Jewish community that until 1945 was the oldest Jewish community in the world. The faith that united that community was carried with them into Babylonia, and longer based on connection with land and even with language. The Babylonian Talmud is written not in Hebrew, but in Eastern Aramaic. In the first 7 centuries of this era, it was the preeminent Jewish community in terms of scholarship. And the Talmud is a unique doctrine. When the scholars debate an issue of Jewish law or practice, the minority opinion is always presented, and preserved, something that never happened until the institution of the United States Supreme Court. It was always assumed that the majority opinion was right, or the dominant opinion that was chosen right throughout history, and those who were wrong were discarded. But not in the Talmud. There was always the respect for the minority opinion and the possibility that the minority would in the long run turn out to be correct. It was a unique community. Major academies for studies of scholars were founded there. It was not only the professional scholars who studied. In this first 7 centuries of this era, it was the preeminent Jewish community in the world. And uniquely, every year after the harvest was called Kala month. Kala meant in gathering. And farmers would come to the academies to study for a month. The question pursued by professional scholars or by farmers was always the same, whether the topic was business law, agricultural law, or religious ritual. What does the eternal require of me? What do I need to do to live a Jewish life? One definition of who are the Jews might be of the people who constantly ask, what am I required to do to be a Jew? To life. The Jewish dispersion continued. In latter centuries, captives in the Maccabean Wars are carried to Syria, Macedonia, and Greek. And in 63 BCE, Pompey's conquest brings Jewish prisoners to Rome, and a Jewish community is established in Rome. Recently, we're building a road from Rome to the airport. Ruins of a first century BCE synagogue were discovered. We know that in the first century, Jews were active proselytizers. In the Roman world, there was a hunger for meaning and morality. Judaism met that need for many people, and the community grew in Greece and Rome. The Greeks called the Jews a tribe of philosophers because of the Jewish God, who was an idea, who could not be represented by any person or thing. But the early Christians, there were synagogues throughout the Mediterranean. The Sabbath and dietary laws made it difficult, Judaism difficult for many people. One of the Roman historians, Herodotus, complains that no one wants to hire a Jew because they will not work 7 days a week, like every responsible, hard-working person would certainly be expected to do. And those who couldn't do that stood at the gates of the synagogue. And early Christianity, its early converts among those who had left paganism behind and not fully become Jews yet. In the centuries that followed, Jews and Judaism spread slowly through the rest of Europe. When the Roman Empire became Christian in 325, you've heard the legend about Constantine going into war and seeing the cross in front of him. What Constantine actually saw, or at least this is the theory of some historians ascribed to, that it was getting more and more difficult to hold the Roman Empire together, and there were Christian churches throughout the Mediterranean, and each had a bishop. And the deal was made that the Bishop of Rome would be made the head of the Christian church. Then the Christian church, all through the empire, would owe its allegiance to Rome. It was a consolidation of power, as I understand it. And when that happened and Rome became officially Christian, the legal status of the Jew was changed. The church used its influence to have restrictions against Jews. The Council of Laodicea in 343, which met until 380, ruled the suppression of Jewish religion, and Jews were no longer allowed to build synagogues in the Holy Roman Empire. Constantinius II issued edicts forbidding the marriage of Jews and Christians and prohibiting Jews from having any power over Christians as employers. Jews were excluded from public office or serving as civil servants. And incidentally, it was made a crime punishable by death for a Jew to convert a Christian to Judaism. You might say this killed the missionary zeal of the Jews. And you know the Jews as a non-proselytizing people. The Jews were active proselytizers until that point. St. Augustine declared the Jews were not to be killed. That would be too easy for them, but were to bear the mark of Cain, preserved as witnesses to their guilt and our truth. The guilt of the Jews that Augustine refers to is the Jews' refusal to accept Jesus as the unique incarnation of God. When the Nicene Creed triumphs over Arian Christianity, named for Bishop Arius, who denied that Christ was the Son of God, anyone who emphasized the humanness of Jesus is branded by the church as a Judaizer. Jews are repressed and separated from Christianity, always with the reason propounded that they have to be kept away from Christians, because they might lead true believers away from the true faith and into error. They attributed tremendous power to Jews. It seems to have been difficult for the church to accept the fact people from whom Jesus came are those who do not accept him as God, although, of course, all his earliest disciples were Jews. The dominant church in Europe becomes the self-proclaimed enemy of the Jews. No Jew who knows history would ever call a campaign for a good cause a crusade. For the Jews, the Crusades were a time when the Crusaders swept through Europe, destroying every Jewish community in their midst on their way to free the Holy Land from the infidels, meaning the Muslims and the Jews. In some places in Europe, the Jews were offered the choice of baptism or death. In others, the Jews of a village were herded into the synagogue, and the synagogue was set fire to. The Jewish community of France was decimated. Southern France had been a great sense study. Rashi wrote his masterful commentaries on the Bible and the Talmud there. The Crusades destroyed Jewish life. Yet, as you read Jewish history and you talk about the survivors, and I find it absolutely incredible. I have a book here called The Jewish Timeline Encyclopedia, and you can open to any page and you'll read about some incredible scholarly spiritual creativity, and the next time you'll read, the next little item will be the destruction of a Jewish community. Then an item about some Jewish creativity and the destruction of a Jewish community. We are the survivors. It's incredible to understand when you read the history to believe that there's a Jew left on earth today, because every attempt was made to exterminate us permanently. After the Crusades, the Jews who lost faith in the world turned to Kabbalah in the 12th century. A mystical escape, a new dimension of Jewish mysticism was developed out of the ashes of the Crusades. Spain was first settled by Jews in Roman times, called in the Talmud Sephard, and Jews of Spanish or Iberian, Spanish-Portuguese ancestry are called Sephardic Jews. During the Visigothic kingdom, the early Christian kingdom in Spain, the Jews were farmers and prospered until the Visigoths who were Arians, became Catholics. With the Muslim conquest of Spain, a new opportunity arose for the Jews. Jews rose to higher place in Muslim Spain than in any other nation until the Jewish experience in the United States. The Jews were not only farmers, but intellectuals, physicians, philosophers, poets, and government officials. With the reconquest of Spain by the Christians, of the office of the Inquisition, an office of the church which would inquire whether any Roman Catholic had backslid, and that was established in Spain in the 12th century, the condition of the Jews declined. There were persecutions, forced conversions, and expulsions. Finally, when Ferdinand and Isabel had consolidated their power in Castile, in 1492, a date which I believe is coincidental, Jews were given the choice of conversion, expulsion, or death. Most scholars believe that Louis de Torres, the interpreter that Columbus brought with him, was a Jew. Jews knew Arabic, Spanish, Latin, Hebrew. They were the linguists of the Middle East, and incidentally that made them very valuable in international trade because the families had been scattered and they had connections all over. Any extended Jewish family was automatically a national trading house. When even those who chose conversion under the pressure from Ferdinand and Isabel could later be tried by the Inquisition for backsliding and end up being burned at the stake, which was called in Spanish auto de fe, which means an act of faith. An act of faith for the Christians, but not for the Jews who were burned at the stake, or the converts who may have been sincere converts, but when they were burned at the stake, Their estates, their wealth was taken and divided between the church and the crown. There were actually cases where bodies were exhumed and brought to trial and found to be guilty so that their estates could be confiscated. Those who left Spain settled in North Africa, Turkey, and Italy. Some who converted remained secret Jews, leaving Spain a little later for Holland, which was open to Jewish settlement, and some eventually came to the New World. The Inquisition, incidentally, was brought to the New World, where both converted natives and those of Jewish background were burned at the stake in Mexico, in Dominica, and elsewhere in Latin America. In the synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, which Ruth and I have had the privilege of visiting, there are two magnificent brass chandeliers which were given to the synagogue by Aaron Lopez, who arrived in Newport in 1752, 250 years after his family had converted to Catholicism in Portugal. And he was remarried in Newport in a Jewish ceremony with the name Aaron Lopez instead of Alberto as the name he had come with. With his father-in-law Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, names which you hear among Hispanics and who probably have Jews, forcibly converted Jews in their ancestry. He formed a partnership which promoted the whaling industry and helped develop Newport as an important commercial center. In 1763, Aaron Lopez laid the cornerstone of the Newport Synagogue, which is the oldest synagogue building in the United States and which still follows the or Spanish-Portuguese ritual. Most conversos were not able to preserve their Judaism over so long a period as the Lopezes and Riveras, even if they had wanted to, and many probably did not want to. They wanted to be free from persecution and from the onus and burden of being Jewish. The expulsion from Spain in 1492 again gave tremendous impetus to the mystical expression of Judaism. And in Safed, in Palestine, a new center of Jewish mysticism grew up, and in the 16th century created Safed Kabbalah, created a whole mystical Judaism whose reverberations are still being felt in Jewish practice today. It was a tremendous period of despair all over the world after the fall of Jewish Spain, where Jews had been so secure and so much a part of Spanish life. When the church in Europe turned on Jews, frequently the accusation against Jews would be that they desecrated the host. And most Jews knew as much about what the host was as a Muslim would. Another was the blood libel. A Christian child would disappear in the weeks before Passover or Easter, and the Jews would be accused of needing the blood of a Christian child to make the unleavened bread for matzah, for Passover. Now, this is despite the fact that Jewish dietary laws absolutely forbid eating blood. Orthodox Jews today salt a piece of meat and keep it sitting on the drain board for hours till all the blood is taken from it before they will eat it. And yet this myth was that the Jews needed the blood of a Christian child to make matzah for Passover, despite the fact, incidentally, that Passover existed for more than 1,000 years before Christianity, and Jews made matzah for 1,000 years without the blood of a Christian child. A child named Hugh disappeared in Lincoln in England in 1955, and the blood accusation and the ensuing riots and massacres eventually led to the banishing of all Jews from England and from the British Isles in 1290. When Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice, there was not a Jew legally living in England, and Shakespeare had probably never seen a Jew in his life. It was in 1656 under Cromwell, the first Jew began to live openly in England. Although Cromwell never issued an edict permitting it, it was sort of just permitted. In 1723, a law was finally passed permitting Jews born in England to own land. Now, I must tell you that Hugh of Lincoln, that little boy who was supposedly killed by Jews to make matzah, was made by the church St. Hugh of Lincoln. To Lincoln today, you'll find the Cathedral of St. Hugh, except what you will find now is a plaque outside the door placed there by the Anglican Church after World War II, expressing penitence for the wrong that was done against the Jews in Lincoln. Incidentally, the last such blood libel trial took place in Kiev, Ukraine in 1917. It is hard to believe that such ignorance and prejudice can continue into the 20th century. However, in 1917, there were still lynchings going on in the United States, so maybe it's not so hard to believe. Maybe we have to come to own that dark side of ourselves that we pretend not to look at as we think of the world in terms of good guys and bad guys, black hat and white hats, that oversimplification that we love to make and which denies so much of ourselves. The 3 strikes and you're outlaw is the good guys getting rid of the bad guys. But there's also a bad guy inside of each one of us, I do believe. The Crusades had driven Jews into the East to Hungary and Bohemia and Poland. And many times, the rulers of Poland would intervene to protect the Jews from the hostility of the church. In Germany, at the end of the 13th century, Jews were confined by laws into residential districts, shut off by walls and gates, and these areas were not allowed to expand. Once the Jewish area of the city had been determined, no Jew could live outside that area. Walls were built around it, there were gates. Every Jew had to be inside of what later became called the ghetto, and I'll tell you why. And Jews were also not allowed out on. The term ghetto comes from Venice, where ghetto means furnace or smelter. And in Venice, Jews were required to live in the smelter area because that was the smelly and most unpleasant area of town. There was never a wall around it, but that term ghetto became to be used for the forced area the area were forced to live in, and has been used in this country to apply to the areas that African Americans were forced to live in when they were not permitted to build outside of that area, to move outside of that area. In Poland, Jews were required to live in small towns next to the larger cities, as in Kamieres, next to Krakow, which you may know from the movie Schindler's List, which I hope all of you will see, which should be a part of this course. It's an excellent movie, and I must tell you, it's not as much of a downer as it could be because it ends on a positive note. So don't be afraid. You really can. Incidentally, I've seen pictures of the ghetto in Frankfurt in Germany from the 17th and 18th century. We see these tremendous narrow little streets and 7- and 8-story houses because the Jews could only build up. They couldn't move out. In the late 16th century, the Polish nobility, Poland was still in feudalism until the 20th century. Poland and Russia were living societies. And the oppression of the peasants, because the aristocracy never gives up its ways of life, and if times are bad, they just put the greater pressure on those below. And that, my friends, exists in every country of the world, including the United States today, where the stock market goes to all-time high as unemployment grows. And in Poland, when the oppression of the peasants became so bad in the 16th century, an impoverished nobleman by the name of Khmelnytsky led a revolt in the Ukraine, Galicia, White Russia, and Lithuania. And while they were revolting against the nobility, 700 Jewish communities were decimated. The worst massacre of Jews until the Holocaust. Some Jews fled to Russia, to the east, and back to Western Europe. One of my favorite stories, Rimway, is in the city where the Jewish section is just in ruins and not a Jew is left. A man walks into a marketplace and sees a Jew standing behind a booth in the marketplace. No merchandise, nothing there. And he asks him, "What are you selling?" He says, "I have faith for sale." Then, like any barker in the marketplace, he cries out, "Faith for sale! Faith for sale!" Out of their despair, Jews again turned to mysticism, and a mystical movement began in Eastern Europe, which by the 1700s led to the birth of the Hasidic movement, a movement of inward piety, humble joy, and the service of humanity. The message was that even the most impoverished and oppressed person could rejoice and be happy in the presence of God, regardless of what was happening to you out there. Other Jews turned to classical Jewish study. There was not a city in Eastern Europe the size of Santa Rosa or even Roman Park that was not a center of Jewish scholarship. I must tell you, there were many Jews. By the 19th century and the oppression in Eastern Europe, some turned deeper and deeper into a religion that was rather ingrown, and the community was divided. Others turned to political solutions. One, Zionism, the hope if only the Jews could get to Israel and rebuild a land there away from other people, away from oppressors, the Jews could live a decent life. And the others turned to socialism, believing that only a radical change in social structure could make a difference where people could live in decency. And I guess, all the movements had a piece of the truth. A piece of the truth. Eastern European Jews moved in large number to the United States at the end of the 19th century and the 20th century. There have actually been now discovered and published documents from the Kremlin, which was the head of the Tsarist government, where the Tsars, the government would send orders to the Cossacks, which is why Jews don't like the name of your team being named Cossacks. Cossacks were the soldiers of the Tsars, the elite guard of the Tsars, who would ride into a Jewish community, plan where there was political unrest, and stir up the people. Not we, the poor helpless nobility, it's the Jews who are the responsibility for your suffering. Many, many Jews, several million Jews left Russia and came to the United States, with leaving parts of their family in the cemeteries after having been killed by the pogroms or being afraid that the pogrom would hit their village next. And that's why most of the Jews in the United States are of Eastern European origin. You know the ploy of the Tsars, the Kremlin, did not work. The manipulation of the Cossacks did not work. And eventually that radical revolution took place that totally overthrew the government, the communist revolution. It didn't happen for nothing. The majority of the people, what we in this country never understood, we saw those people only oppressed. But we did not understand is that everyone in Russia, except the nobility, lived in oppression until that revolution took. And under communism, in the first generations, the people were better off than they had ever been. The illiteracy in Russia, 70% of the people were illiterate when the revolution took place. And now it's a literate country. It was not all bad news for them. I understand that last week you heard an excellent lecture giving the background of Germany between the two wars and have a good idea why Hitler needed a scapegoat to blame for the problems of Germany. The church through the century had fingered the Jews as the guilty party. Added to that German reformer of the church, Luther, who at first had courted the Jews and vilified the church for their treatment of the Jews and expected the Jews to then rush to him for conversion. And when the Jews, in appreciation for his attack on the anti-Semitism of the church, did not immediately become members of his new church, then Luther turned in anger against the Jews. And I must tell you, he wrote Against the Jews, which was found by American soldiers in Hitler's private library. It's about as bad as anything gets. I've tried to give you a quick view of the movement of this people, Israel, the Jewish people, through the pages of history. I've spent more time on the distant past than the recent past, with the assumption that it is less available to you. I've not had time to mention the tremendous contribution of the Jews to the arts, science, medicine, and philosophy. Nor have I talked about the Holocaust in Europe, which you will get in so many other ways in this lecture series. The renewal of the Jewish settlement in the Holy Land is one of the great stories of the 20th century. Not a story without conflict. There was a group of Jewish intellectuals, leaders, who before the state of Israel was founded, had a group called Yichud, which means together, which were seeking not a state but a binational state where Jews and Arabs would be absolutely equal, where there would be two official languages, Hebrew and Arabic. Martin Buber, the noted philosopher, was one of those. Judah Magnus, after whom the Magnus Museum, who was originally from the Bay Area in Berkeley, is named. Judah Magnus, who was the first president of Hebrew University, was one of these. Chaim Weizmann, who was the first president of the State of Israel, was one of these. But tragically, there was no response from the Arab world. And these Jews who put their necks out and always lived in a controversial position vis-a-vis many of the other Jewish settlers, eventually, as you know, what happened was a Jewish state was proclaimed. And it has been hard for there to be justice. I must tell you, I have myself anguished over the problems. About 10 years ago, I was asked to speak to the Central Conference of American Rabbis on my relationship to the State of Israel. And when I got the call, I said, this is a setup. All you want me to do is to take all the flack, because the person who called me knew how conflicted I am. And I must tell you, after I got the call, he says, you mean you won't do it? I said, no, I'll do it. And then I went out to get my newspaper. We lived in the woods, and I went out and ran every morning. When I came back, I picked up my paper before I took the last quarter mile into my house. Front page of the paper was a story about a retaliatory aid of Israel on a Palestinian, on an Arab village in Lebanon. And because I was in the woods, I could just start screaming out of impotence and frustration. And this was how I began my speech to the Central Conference of American Rabbis. And I went on to tell them that during the Vietnam War, William Sloane Coffin, who was later, who was Jewish, who was a Protestant chaplain at Yale University and later minister of the Riverside Church in New York City, and then head of the SANE Committee, the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, then SANE Freeze. William Sloane Coffin, at a rally in New York City against the war, said that I have a lover's quarrel with America. And I said, I don't have a lover's quarrel with the State of Israel. It's worse. It's a family fight. And you know, and I could be angry at something somebody in my family does and not speak to me anymore. And some people, I understand, have families where there's an uncle or somebody, or cousin where nobody speaks to. But they don't cease being your uncle, aunt, or cousin. You're still related. And as a Jew, and I think every Jew, remains related and invested in everything that happens in the State of Israel. They are my people. I am them. They are me. This is part of what it means to be a Jew. Because we are one people, what happens in that land is of direct concern to every Jew everywhere. There have been Jews since colonial days. We have been, as I said, in my own family. My grandmother's family was here before the Revolution, was pardon the expression, of the Confederacy. I come from North Carolina myself. And my mother's father However, my family all came over in the 19th century. My mother's family, my mother's father came from Krakow in Poland. I just found his gravestone in our graveyard last time Ruth and I were in North Carolina last May. He's buried away from the rest of the family because he died when my mother was a child. We have a big family plot. He's not a part of it. See, Krakow, Poland. Krakow is where Schindler's List takes place. My father's family came from Grodno, a center of Jewish learning. My name, incidentally, Robinson, is not a changed name. Rabban in Russo-Polish means rabbi. And my great-grandfather was the last, was after 6 generations of rabbis. My great-grandfather was Ben Rabban, or Robinson, the son of the rabbi. And that's how we got our name. But in this country, Jews have been a part of every current and of thought. But I will tell you something. I've heard Jews say, you know, I'm grateful to America. America gave us our freedom. America, the United States, gave us a place where we could struggle for our freedom. The first Jew in New York City, Asher Levy, in New Amsterdam, by Peter Stuyvesant, leshel tax on him to pay for somebody else to stand guard duty for him, because as a Jew he couldn't stand guard duty and protect Christians. He appealed to the Hudson Bay Company in Amsterdam and was granted permission to stand guard duty. Every right that Jews have in this country we had to struggle for. In my own state of North Carolina, no Jew could hold office until 1849, I believe, because you had to swear on a New Testament as a Christian when you took your oath of office. Same thing happened in England, where the first Rothschild was elected to Parliament over and over and over again and couldn't serve until like the 1880s. Okay, who are the Jews? We are one people, an extended, open family. We are the elephant people of history. You've heard an elephant doesn't forget. We don't forget. We don't forget the greatness and the suffering of our past. The memory of Sinai forms the central myth of a people who clings to the belief that its existence can have meaning for itself and make a difference in the life of humanity. Those who join themselves with us become a part of that people. Different from other world religions, you know, there's a central figure in most world religions, Jesus Christ in Christianity, Buddha, Muhammad, and the celebrations in that religion represent events in the light of that person. The feast of Jesus' birth, of the circumcision, and of his death and resurrection. Or every Mohammedan observes the period, the Ramadan month, that commemorates Muhammad's pilgrimage to Mecca. Buddhists celebrate Buddha's enlightenment. The central figure in Judaism is the Jewish people, To become a Jew means to become part of people, to be shaped by the Jewish past, the faith born out of the past, and to be shapers of the people and its faith in the future. We are that people, and this is your time now. Thank you. Is never an inappropriate question. I can choose not to answer something if I don't want to, but you can ask me anything you want to, and if I can, I'll answer. If I can't, I'll tell you if I don't know. Yes?
You talked about Jewish people, or you went into churches and they said that, oh, we have a Jew in our congregation. Yeah. Do you include your parents as being non-Jewish, although they are Jewish by blood?
No, well, my parents practiced Judaism. No, that was the parents of Ludwig who wrote that book.
Oh, I thought that you said that.
No, not my parents. My parents, my mother, who comes from multi-generations in the South, my father, who grew up in Galveston, Texas, practiced Judaism and were ardent Jews who believed, who were real believers. But Ludwig Lewison's parents, you can say, what about them? They never did anything. They didn't practice Judaism. Were they Jews? Yes, they were potentially Jewish in a way that someone who isn't born Jewish is. They had never done anything to sever themselves from the Jewish people. any act that separated themselves from the Jewish people. They just hadn't done anything. And the very fact that Ludwig Lewison became a practicing Jew and then wrote that lovely book that you now have in your hand is because he had Jewish parents. So there was a potential in them. I think of Jews, these many Jews, as somebody who has an inheritance. Assume that you were given by your parents a trunk, a locked trunk, which they had inherited from their parents. They said their parents had got it from their parents, but they never opened it to look inside. And you take the trunk and you pass it to your children without ever opening to look inside. They still are possessors of this Jewish trunk, this Jewish heritage, but they have yet to explore it, and its presence is known to them. Others are smart enough to open up the trunk and see what's inside and be enriched by it.
What about people who are not born?
People who are not born by Jewish can choose to be part of that experience and part of that people and part of that faith. My congregation has many people who are not Jewish. I was just telling Muncie Harper, we were talking beforehand about the movie Schindler's List, and my congregation went to watch as a group and then came back to the synagogue to discuss it. I thought we needed a debriefing. And I went up to some woman while we were having cake and coffee before. Jews don't do anything without eating. And I went up to one woman who was a convert to Judaism, was wondering what her reaction to the movie was as someone who wasn't born Jewish. And here was this whole experience. And I didn't ask my question clearly. I thought my question was just perfectly obvious because I knew what I was asking. I said, how did you react to the movie? And her reaction to the movie was just like any born Jew who'd had grandparents and great-grandparents who were Jewish. That became her history. She identified with that process, and I was really kind of surprised. She didn't understand my question, what I intended, but it wasn't even appropriate. My question made an assumption that somehow or other her feelings would be different than mine, and they weren't. Yes?
Do you think that Jesus was out to start a whole new religion, or do you think he was just trying to reform Judaism?
Jesus never started out to found a whole new religion. Even Christian scriptures do not describe Jesus as founding a whole new religion. Jesus was born and died as a Jew. His followers, primarily Paul, founded a whole new religion of Jesus. Jesus was never a Christian. Jesus was never a Christian. He was called Christ a long time after he died, a long time. Yes?
Can you explain to us how Jesus differed from Jewish expectations of who the Messiah would be, especially as described in the Bible?
Well, all right, now your question, have you all heard of the West Star Institute? The seminars started with Albert Schweitzer, started at the beginning of the 19th century. What? The question was, how did Jesus differ from the Jewish expectation of a Messiah? And at the beginning of the 19th century, this is a long answer for a simple question, but I will tell you, at the beginning of the 19th century, began the Christian community, people who called the search for the historic Jesus, trying to find out who, after all, the only account we have of Jesus was written long after he died by people who wanted to spread a religion about him. Now, if the only thing we knew about President Bush was written about Republicans 50 years to 100 years after he died who wanted to get people to become Republicans, it'd be a hard time finding the truth about Bush. And still, well, we're finding out that more and more of the truth was hidden from us deliberately. So that's a bad comparison. But you'll pardon the comparison. We have Jesus from people. The scholars believe the book of Mark, which is the oldest book of the Christian scriptures, was written a generation after he died by somebody who never knew him. They were given the names of disciples onto the books. The book of John has practically nothing to do with Jesus. It was all about Jesus, written in Greek, 100 years after he died, and most of the ideas that you have, he who believeth on me shall be saved, none shall come to the Father except through the Son, that's all from the book of John. And so it's written in Greek, never existed in any other language. Probably none of Jesus' followers even spoke Greek. So you've got a great distance between. Now, there were a number of different Jewish ideas of the Messiah. Messiah in Hebrew is Mashiach, means anointed one. The way you became king was by being anointed. Is anybody here old enough to have seen the coronation of Queen Elizabeth in England? The Archbishop of Canterbury, we saw it on television, poured a little vial of oil on her head. She became a Mashiach, an anointed one, and had the divine right to rule. That's what the word Messiah means in Hebrew, the anointed one. And many Jews who lived under Roman oppression would hope that a scion of the house of David, an anointed one, would free them from Roman rule. And then, as they were at it, they got the idea not only would they free them from Roman rule, maybe they would, Jesus was doing that very simple task, the empire of Rome being the greatest in the world, and them being a tiny little people, that eventually it would lead to the establishment of peace and harmony throughout the world. Now, Jesus didn't do any of these things. And what happened was and this is controversial. I know there are Christians here who disagree with me, and this is my understanding of reading Christian scholarship. What happened is after Jesus died, who believed after he died and built this new doctrine about him as a Messiah, took an idea that was not Jewish and took it from the Greco-Roman mystery cults of the gods who are born, died, and go to the panoply of gods in heaven. And they had to redefine the idea of Messiah. They had to create the doctrine of the second coming, because the first coming had not changed the human condition. We do not live in a more just world, a more peaceful world than existed at the time of Jesus. So the doctrine of the second coming was necessary because the transformation of human society sure hasn't happened yet. And for mainline Jews, what the coming of the Messiah means is not even a person, but the transformation of human society. There's a wonderful story in the Talmud that when the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem, the Messiah was sitting on the wall of the temple, and the Messiah was shattered into thousands and thousands of, and one of those pieces is lodged in a different human being in some different part of the world, and only when all those pieces are brought together will the Messiah have come, when all the peoples of the world come together in peace and love. But Dr. Steiner, you had a question or comment?
I had a comment which responds, particularly responding to your tremendous lecture, which has been very powerful, is how important it is to define and help the people to understand the background of the Jews. Because we still have this sort of myth which prevails, and especially after Hitler, that defines Jews as a race. Defines Jews in so many ways which vilifies them and makes it very simple for them to use them as scapegoats, which Hitler managed to do very successfully. And therefore it's very important to understand what you have said and take note of that, because Hitler has made inroads in terms of the definition which he gave and has been accepted by still very many people, including Jews of today.
I'll tell you, one thing I learned as a Jew is I take language very seriously. I take language very seriously. And I'm really awful. I'm very picky about the words I use. And people use words like race and nation, without even thinking about what they're saying. Incidentally, as far as I'm concerned, I don't call the United States Americans. We are Americans, but not the only Americans. The majority of people who are Americans speak Spanish, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. We are United States citizens, and I think there's something arrogant about our use of the word. And so I take the use of every word seriously. And I think we use a word like race. Hitler was a racist, and he had a doctrine of a superior race, the Aryan race, and the inferior race, the Jewish race. And because he was a racist, it was a convenient way for him to speak. And, we're not different species of animals. There are not any two people on earth who are called humans who can't mate and produce another human. We are one human family. We're all humans. We're not that different. We couldn't mate. Sure.
How do you feel about or mixed religious marriages? And the second question, would you watch a ceremony?
I am a survivor of a small people, a remnant. The oldest synagogue in New York City, the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, is called Shereth Yisrael, which means remnant of Israel. That's how they saw themselves, a remnant of Israel. And I am part of that remnant of Israel. If there had not been these attempts to eliminate us over and over and over again in history, there'd be millions of us. We represent less than 0.25% of the world's population. Less than 0.25% of the world's population. I believe that we have a tradition and a heritage and ideas and ideals that the world could still use and I'd hate to see thrown away. So I like to see those ideas continue. I do believe that the biggest threat to those ideas and ideals is Jews who don't care. And I don't know what you mean by an interreligious marriage. If you mean a marriage by two people who are fervent in two different religions, who put children in the middle between two fervent parents, I would say, don't do that to your children. And I will tell you the other thing. If you're fervent about your own religion, the nicest thing is to have someone who cares about what you care about to share it with you. If I were a Roman Catholic, I could think nothing more binding to my spouse than to at the communion rail with my spouse. I would think that would be the deepest thing that you could share, to be able to kneel at the communion rail together. However, if someone is not born a Jew and wants to be married by a rabbi to a Jew, I believe that they stand with the rabbi to be married. They're saying that somehow or other, maybe not fully defined, we choose to identify with this historic community that goes back to Abraham and Sarah and extends across the globe, participate in that marriage. Does that answer your question, or is that so many words it got lost? Okay?
Joshua ben Joseph, who was known Jesus Christ, whatever you want to call him. Do you think it's possible that he fulfilled some of the conditions on which the ancient prophets like Jeremiah, Micah, Isaiah, predicted the paschal lamb and the rending of the temple curtain and such things as that? Is there a possibility?
Those stories, I understand what you're saying. Those stories come to us long and were written down long after the time of Jesus. And there was a very strong desire among the early Christians to show that Jesus was the Messiah that they believe was predicted in the Hebrew Bible. There are statements in the Hebrew Bible that are completely misunderstood because they work from the Greek translation of the Hebrew. For instance, the wildest thing is the volume of the doctrine of the virgin birth. Isaiah says, a young woman shall conceive and bear a child, and his name will be Emmanuel, God is with us. He's talking about a time when the Assyrians were attacking Jerusalem, and people were in such despair. And he says, someday the time will come when a young woman will conceive and can bear a child that would be named God is with us, which nobody would have done when the city was under siege. Now, when that was translated in the Bible, Alma, which is young woman in Hebrew, which is the only word that appears there, was translated virgin in the Greek. There's a specific Hebrew word for virgin, which is Betula. That word is not used by Isaiah. So you get the translation, a virgin shall conceive. So then the story of the virgin birth has to start. But it's very interesting. If you'll read the first chapter of the book of Matthew, the first thing you get is a genealogy of Jesus. Does anybody know what's wild about that genealogy? It traces him to King David through his father, which simply tells me that that genealogy existed before the story of the virgin birth did. Because if Joseph was not his father, why trace his ancestry to King David to prove that he is the descendant of David? He was not the descendant of David if the virgin birth story is true. So something has to be off. Jesus, as we understand Jesus the Jew, lived and taught as a Jew As many Jews in his time, there's hardly a thing in the teaching of Jesus which you cannot find in the teaching of rabbinic Judaism of the same period, critical of the priesthood and the temple, critical of the establishment. I would probably have found myself very compatible with his idea of Judaism.
With the current economic and political crisis in Eastern Europe and Russia, and the new movement of Nazis and stuff over in Europe, do you have any hopes or aspirations or see any chances that things might not turn out as tragic as they have in the past?
God only knows, but a Spanish Jewish poet, philosopher, physician, these Renaissance people, the woods were full of them, by the name of Judah Halevi, described the Jewish people. He said, "We are of hope." And I am one of those prisoners of hope. In the darkest hour, I hope for the best. And certainly what is going on in Russia is frightening. The United States interference has not contributed in any positive way. The United States backed Yeltsin too fast. Gorbachev we wanted somebody the big thing is free market economy, which means the freedom for international corporations to operate across national boundaries. And Yeltsin was seen to be backed over Gorbachev because Yeltsin was for free market economy. And we really should stay out of other people's business, not mess in other people's wells, and let other people work out their problems and find the system that works for them, rather than trying to impose our system, which is a great system but is not working for us right now. If the system is working, ask someone who. I think the figure right now is that you read every day in the financial section. AT&T last week let off 15,000 more workers. I think it averages out to something like 3,000 people a day are being laid off in the United States. The Pentagon's reducing the size by 181,000 people. We're not finding jobs for these people.
And the profits doubled or tripled.
The stock market goes up. But these are serious issues that we have to look at instead of repeating slogans like free market economy, socialism. We just throw out slogans as if to tell you where you're supposed to be. We've got to find a way to solve our problems. This is not what I'm supposed to be here talking about. Forgive me. But I'll tell you, what happens when people don't face reality, then they find someone to blame, and that's when the Jews get it. Yes?
I'd like to make a comment about hope we touched on here. This was a major force, I believe, allowing Nazi Germany to rise. Now, we have right here in the Holocaust Center 2 documents. One is a folk song book, printed rather recently. I can't remember the exact date, but within the past 20 years. Old English folk song. And there is the folk song about Hugh of Lincoln. Right?
You've got it. Oh, I've never seen that one.
Carol got it. It's in any library, too. The other is all you English majors. You're reading your Chaucer, The Nun's Tale. There it is again. That's 2. Third one is my own family experience. My sister's nursemaid, who I never knew. This was handed down to me from my family. My sister's nursemaid. She was born in 1925. She was an immigrant German woman. Kate. My mother loved her. She really never believed we were Jews because we didn't have horns.
The business of Jews and horns comes from mistranslation of the Hebrew. Michelangelo did a statue of Moses. It's in the church of San Pietro in Vecchio, St. Peter's in the Chains, outside of Rome. A statue of Moses that shows Moses with horns on it, and it's because the Hebrew says this came down from the mountain with karne on it, with keren, which means ray of light or horn. You know how a ray of light shapes horn? Cornucopia is one of the few English words from that Hebrew word for horn. And then because of a mistranslation from the Hebrew to the Greek to the Vulgate in Latin that translated the ray of light as horn. If you see it in the Hebrew Bible or Jewish translation, there were rays of light emanating from Moses' head. Latin Bible has horns on his head. The myth began that Jews had horns. And I can tell you, during the Depression, one of my uncles, we lived in the mountains of North Carolina, and he lost his job way back up in the mountains, and he moved into the mountains of North Georgia, into a little town named Ellijay, which had 900 people. He opened a little general store, and my uncle was bald, and he always wore a hat on his head. And people would come into his little store, Simon's Dry Goods, waiting for Mr. Simon's to take so they could see the horns, because he knew that's why he wore a hat. And they would, they'd talk outside and see what you can do to get Mr. Simons to take off his hat. But this this myth of distance and of ignorance and the assumption that the worst must be the truth, that we like to dehumanize those who we choose as enemies. During the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese were called the gooks. Dehumanize, and it makes it easier to kill them. And this was certainly done in the South with blacks, African Americans. When I grew up and up into this, way into this century, was the dehumanization of the other. Make them as different as you can from you, and it's easier to hate them or to oppress them. That was the desire. But it started with an error in translation. A German Jewish poet, Heinrich Heine, who incidentally had converted to Christianity. And he said, my conversion was the silver spoon that I had not been born with in my mouth. In other words, his transport to society, he was converted, he was a Christian, but he wrote like a Jew. One of the things that Heine said was that to read a literature in translation is like kissing a woman through a handkerchief. There's always staying something between you and the real text.
I'm not familiar with the story of Abraham. What was it that happened with the first Jew?
Abraham is in the 12th chapter of the book of Genesis, where Abraham receives a call from God to get thee out of thy country, the place where thou art born, and thy father's house, into the place which I will show you. And he begins a migration that began in the Tigris Valley, or the Euphrates. Which one's on the left on the map? I always get them mixed up. I think what?
They can't help you.
I know. One goes up this way and the other one goes up this way. No, it's the one on this side. Ur of Chaldea is where he started like that. He went up to Haran, which is in Syria. The family was originally from there, moved into Syria, and then he migrates down into the land of Canaan and separates himself from the peoples around him. There are all kinds of Jewish legends about him and his discovery of God. But he is following a voice within that he has to leave his father's house in order to follow that voice, to find a new path. So in Jewish mythology, he is the first Jew. Mythology, incidentally, has nothing to do with truth or untruth. It's the way we explain our relationship to the earth and to the world and to life. It may or may not describe something true. That's not calling something a myth is not putting it down. A myth is an intrinsic human experience. I look at Jung and Considerer from my understanding of myth.
So then what religion was he before?
Before, what he was one of those people in the Tigris and Euphrates valleys in Ur. They had these magnificent ziggurats, these stepped-up pyramids. They offer sacrifices on top of them, and they had a whole polytheon of gods. They were polytheists, gods that represented the different forces of nature: God of war and a God of peace, and God of fire and a God of earth. They had the whole equipment. There was different Jewish idea of the one God, monotheism. The one God who demands ethical behavior between human beings, who is manifest and known through ethical behavior in human beings. You can't see God, but you know God only through ethical behavior between human beings. Yes. Well, you've been very, very patient You sat for a very long time. Myself, I'm glad I was standing instead of sitting, but thank you very much.